Thank you for coming to the large projects discussion. So, as you probably have heard, we're very sorry that John Canti was ill and was not able to come. But we do have a presentation, a video of his that we're going to be showing a clip of where he's going to make some of the comments he would have made had he been able to be here. And we're very fortunate James Gentry was able to step in at the last minute to fill in for John and add some of his own comments, both in response to the video clip as well as his own comments. So we thought of this panel in part because so often the model or mode of translating that we talk about tends to be one translator working on one text, what we might call the translator in the cave paradigm. And that's oftentimes what happens. You have one translator works in a cave on a text for 2 years and then turns it over to a publisher, maybe works with an editor, and then it gets published. But that's not always the way translating happens. It oftentimes happens that a group of translators are working together in a group, like the Lamrim Chenmo project, sometimes in different places on the planet, sometimes in the same room at the same time, sometimes both. That seems to be happening more and more, as we've heard at this conference. And so sometimes a large project includes just that, many translators working on maybe different parts of a text, collaboratively or at the same time or sequentially. That's one idea of what a large project can mean. A large project can also mean a text which has multiple layers to it. So for example, you might have a Tibetan text and a Sanskrit text, both of which you're using, so you sort of have two texts. You also might have several Tibetan commentaries and several Sanskrit commentaries. You might have 5 texts that are all sort of focusing on the same work. So that's another concept of a large project, which again might be multiple people involved. And then going larger than that, we have the idea of a large project being something like the 84,000 project to translate the entire Kongir, or the IABS project to translate the entire Tengdir. So the idea of more than one translator working on more than one text sort of at the same time, or a body of text, there's different kinds of challenges that come up when you're doing that as opposed to the one translator model, and different kinds of solutions that might need to be considered. So that's what this discussion will be about, large projects considered in any one of those ways. Our speakers will have various points to make on both of those topics. And then once we've done that, a couple introductory remarks, then we will show John's video for a little bit, a few more remarks, and then open it up to discussion. So, James?
Okay, I should go first.
Well, he's going to introduce the screen, I think. Maybe
okay, Bob.
So, obviously there's very few people because the people who are doing these large projects are all in hiding. Because nobody would undertake such a thing in their right mind. And in my case, I sort of semi-volunteered and was semi-dragooned into it in 1971, too, when I was just finishing my doctorate, after having been a year in India, in Dharamsala and Dalhousie and Almora and a few places. And during which time His Holiness suggested that I translate Jairam Rinpoche Sungbum, Tsongkhapa Sungbum, because I like Tsongkhapa. I'm very fanatically fond of him. I consider him the greatest mind of the 15th century. And in the world, not just in Tibet. I consider him the head of the Renaissance, global Renaissance, operating on the theory of morphic resonance. The Italians were just following in the train, just like the Italians got their pasta from Tibet. They also got the vibration of the human individual being able to achieve something from Tibet. But of course, they don't know that. And the sort of psychic plane, of energy plane. So that kind of last axial age that we had, I consider him the great one. So I was really into it. So someone said, yeah, you should translate his Sungbum. So then at a later meeting in America, when His Holiness was there, with Geshe Wangyal said, oh, yeah, Tsongkhapa Sungbum, that's a good idea. I know you want to do that. But you know, people will not appreciate Tsongkhapa Sungbum. And Tsongkhapa at that time has not been widely translated because it's very difficult. His writing is a little bit difficult. And people prefer, poetry and other things, maybe a little bit easier. And so it's good that you undertake that. But people will not appreciate it unless they have the Tengdir accessible, which is what Jairam Rinpoche draws all his things from. Everything he does, like Dalai Lama nowadays says he is the heir of the 17 great pundits of Nalanda. So Jairam Rinpoche also was heir of the great 17 pundits of Nalanda. And so if they don't have the Tengdir, they won't really appreciate the greatness of Tsongkhapa. So you have to do the Tengdir also, the whole thing. And His Holiness said, oh, that's a really great idea. And then I said, I just was getting just getting started really teaching, and I said, well, thanks a lot, guys. That's really great. How am I supposed to do that? Like thousands of books. And they said, oh, of course, you're not going to get it done in a lifetime. You just set up the thing that gets going with it, and try to set up the thing that will do it in subsequent generations, and you do whatever you can do, So they said like that. And that apparently stayed in His Holiness's mind, because in around 2009, I can't remember the last time His Holiness came to Colombia. He came there at the time we had organized that we raised the money for a chair in Tibetan history, which was occupied by Great Tunnel, as some of you may know. And we invited His Holiness at that time. And he did a World Leaders Forum with the President of Colombia, and then they had a luncheon afterwards. And at the luncheon, to my surprise, His Holiness says to Lee Bollinger, the President of Colombia, well, Professor Thurman needs at least 3 lifetimes to finish his project. So Bollinger is very clever and smart, so he immediately responded, oh, that's really great, Your Holiness, but we don't have that system here at Columbia. And then I was a little shy to say what I thought, which was, you mean I can't reincarnate in my chair? Like, what's the matter with you? But of course I didn't say it. I've just been thinking it ever since. So therefore, we founded in 1972 the American Institute of Buddhist Studies, initially at Geshe Wangyal's place. And we got a grant from the Institute for Advanced Studies of World Religions. And Art Engel was working with us at that time, actually. And we brought some Geshes from India. And we worked on a bunch of books, a few of which, Suchalankara, Bodhisattva Bhumi, have been published, but a lot of them have languished in rough drafts all over the place. And because of whatever, being too busy, but we'll eventually get to them, some of the other ones. Or Art will, or somebody will. And so that's just my initial introduction to why I'm up here. It isn't that I'm committed to it, of course, but maybe I should be committed. That's the other possibility. I'm aware of that. Because it's a really difficult thing. Because people think, I know, I want to hear Milarepa singing a poem, and I want to go to the hills and meditate. This really complicated, huge thing, they don't really, they're not so excited about. But I believe they should be done, and I will come back after John has talked and James have talked. I will come back with a little more talk about why I think it should be done and why I think it's a supremely high priority, but I won't launch into that now. I'm just explaining how it is that I'm guilty as accused sitting here. That's all, to start with. Your turn, James, and John's.
Yeah, okay. So my story is quite different. I'm here because John Canti is not. And so I was asked to sort of sit in his place just for the discussion section. We do have a video of him, though, but I'm just going to introduce very generally something about the project before John does so in greater depth. So it's 84,000, right? As we all know, this number has a certain resonance, certain significance, as this vast number of teachings that Buddha Shakyamuni gave to dispel the vast number of afflictions, the vast number of beings, and all their different proclivities and habits. So there's something of the spirit of incredible diversity intrinsic to the name of the project. And there's something in the project itself, of course, that has necessitated an incredible diversity of community involvement. So we have communities of Buddhist practitioners, scholars strewn across the world, and collaborating, actually, in rich ways that probably hasn't been seen before. So we have translation groups consisting of academics as well as Buddhist practitioners. In the process of reviewing the texts, a group of translations that were produced by Buddhist practitioner groups and scholars working together are then reviewed by other Buddhist practitioner scholars. And anyways, there's this rich dialogue and hybridity that's kind of arisen out of the context, really blurring the boundaries between the scholar practitioner world and the academic world, these kinds of boundaries that are trying to be blurred with the conference like this as well. So I just have witnessed the effects of that, actually, in the project have been quite unique and unexpected, and I think we can see more of that as we go forward. Interesting collaborations where practitioners find themselves in the shoes of scholars. Scholars find themselves newly inspired by the practitioner world, And we can see more and more of that, I think, as this project moves forward. Of course, there are many problems, many challenges that the project poses, and we'll get into that with John's video and then after that. So what we're going to do is just play John Canti by remote. He recorded this a few days ago while convalescing, so you can understand if there are a few pauses in his speech. But we'll only play the first segment of it, so the first 13 minutes, and then he presents a few problems. And the video is kind of long, so I'm just going to paraphrase what those issues are after we play this introductory bit. So I'm going to move first.
So, hello everybody. Hello Tom, Bob, Mike, James, and all of you who are here to discuss the multi-text, multilingual, large-scale projects and their particular needs and requirements. First of all, I must say I'm so sorry not to be there in person. Unfortunately, I really wasn't able to travel. I'm happy to say I'm feeling a bit better now. I'm doing my best in this quick video presentation to present the 84,000 project, at least in summary, to give some kind of basis for your discussions. Basically, we've been running now for about 7 years. It started in the 2009 Conference of Translators in Bir in Himachal Pradesh in India, and started off in reality in 2010. Initially under the aegis of the Kensi Foundation, which provided the sort of seeding and nurturing that a project like this needed to get off the ground. And since 2013, 84,000 has been an independent organization with its own board and working committee and financially independent set up as a 501c3, non-profit organization under US law. So, so far we've managed to publish online 32 works of various lengths, 24 sutras and 8 tantras, and there are about 70 more works in the final pre-publication stages. In other words, they should appear soon, and about 130 more texts that are currently in the process of being translated. And of the 70,000 pages of the Kanjur, we currently have in progress about 25,000 pages. So that's about a third of the Kanjur as a whole. And as our original target was to try to produce the Kanjur in English within the first 25 years, we are more or less on target. The original goal of the 84,000 project was larger than simply the Kanjur. It was to include the Tenjur and possibly the Nyingma Gyubum, the collection of Nyingma Tantras that for various historical reasons were left out of the Kanjur itself. But in the initial phases at least, we're concentrating mainly on the getting the Kanjur done before we adventure into the other canonical collections. So I think it's important to point out that 84,000 is both a publisher and a translation project. The way we work is to give grants to translation teams, currently 38 teams of translators who are working in various parts of the world on different texts, so different teams of different composition, but usually more than one person. And we work by receiving grants by a process of open application, receiving applications, by a process of open application, and then making sure that we follow up on the progress of any particular translation, and crucially, we don't give all the grants at once. We give the grants in slices according to the progress that is happening on the actual text and according to satisfactory results. So this has helped us to avoid some of the traps of giving large grants for long texts and not seeing any useful results within a reasonable time period. So how do we proceed? Well, there are many aspects of editorial policy that we had to consider. First of all, perhaps the source texts. Obviously, the main goal of the project was to try to produce a version of the Kanjur in English and perhaps in other modern languages, although for the time being we've had to concentrate mainly on the English. So it's kind of logical to start with the Tibetan translations. But on the other hand, there are about 15% of the works in the Kanjur that have an extant Sanskrit text. So occasionally we have to make the choice to use the Sanskrit primarily and to translate it with an eye on the Tibetan and to note the main differences. Occasionally, even when there's a Sanskrit text, we prefer to stick as closely as possible to the Tibetan in terms of structure and content, and use the Sanskrit as a guide for particular passages or particular terms. It really depends very much on the individual case and particularly on the closeness of the surviving Sanskrit text with the presumed Sanskrit original that the Tibetan translators used back in the 8th, 9th centuries. So we don't have a completely fixed policy on that issue. In some cases we have produced a diplomatic edition of the Sanskrit and published it along with the text. This is already the case in a couple of the tantras that we've published. We of course recognize the importance of full critical editions, and it would be wonderful to have critical editions for all of the texts that we translate. It's simply not the case, and if we were really going to go that way, we would probably have produced about 2 or 3 texts by now in the 7-year period. And we've decided early on that the difference it would make in terms of making available the contents of these texts that are in the Kanjur, the difference perhaps is important in some cases, but it's very often fairly marginal. But the difference in time and the difference in resources is enormous, and so we're able to keep producing what we hope are reasonable translations produced according to a reasonable compromise on the usual full-scale philological methods. But we can keep up the momentum, try and get through the collection within a reasonable time frame, and use the funds that have been made available by people's enthusiasm, because we don't really have funding from any particular institutions, in order to keep going. And of course there's always room to improve the texts, tighten up certain aspects later as we go along. We also take care to note the significant variance that we find between different Kanjurs. In most cases we start with the Derge Kanjur as a reasonably reliable version. Comparing it with other Kanjurs these days has been made easier by the existence of the Pedurma comparative edition published in China, which compares the Derge reading with about 6 other Kanjurs. Unfortunately, most of the other Kanjurs it uses in the comparison are from a similar grouping, the Tsalpa lineage by and large. So we find it actually quite useful in case of problems to consult one of the manuscript editions that are more closely related to the Tempangma lineage of Kanjurs. And one of the most easily accessible is the Stock Palace Kanjur, which is a manuscript Kanjur from Stock Palace in Ladakh, and is quite easily accessible online. We chose also, again this is related, to publish electronically online rather than to be in the business of producing and printing and distributing books. So this has saved us an awful lot of trouble, makes things much easier, and of course there are also many advantages to electronic publishing. You don't have that terrible feeling when you're going to press that this is it, and any mistakes that might appear after the book's published can never be corrected. We are continuously updating, correcting, adding to, cross-referencing the texts that we publish, and I don't think the collection will ever be entirely definitive. We may actually print books at some point. We certainly haven't excluded that possibility. In terms of archiving, it's probably the best option. Who knows when the internet will suddenly be switched off or disappear. We are doing our best to make sure that our database is well protected and will survive, but of course that's hard to guarantee completely. So another big question is terminology, and we had to decide quite early on, were we going to try and dictate a particular fixed terminology or equivalence of Sanskrit and Tibetan terms with particular English ones. We decided that actually it was too early in the state of things regarding the translation of Buddhist texts into English. Of course, many terms have been used and more or less consensually accepted, and we have no objection to that. I think there's still room for creative innovation. We try to stay within consensually accepted norms, but we allow the translators a reasonable degree of flexibility and personal choice. And the most important thing perhaps is to try and make it as easy as possible for readers and other translators to see what terms have been translated, how, and this is of course facilitated by the glossaries of individual texts that can be quite easily consulted online, and we are in the process of creating at last a cumulative glossary that actually covers all of the texts we published so far and allows people to see the whole range of different terms that have been used for any particular term in Sanskrit or Tibetan, or vice versa, working backwards from an English term. So there are, of course, apart from terminology itself, there are many other questions of style, approach, syntax, how to avoid getting very stilted translations that follow the syntax of the original too closely, and so on. I think this is probably not the place to discuss all of those right now. We have tried to assemble all of the different criteria we use and all of the different advice that we give into a translator guidelines document, which all of the translators receive and use as the basis for their approach, and is also used by our editors, copy editors and other kinds of editors as we approach the publication to try and make sure that the work that has been done conforms as much as possible to those guidelines, with the idea of producing a reasonably coherent collection. So one question that obviously comes up is, why are we doing this? Should we be doing it? And I think...
So
That's about where we
How many minutes is it? Is it 13? Yeah, that's
21. That's about the right
There's
spot.
the part about, he says, the why and the worry about Tantra, but you're going to summarize that, right?
yeah, I thought
That's ways down, though, because that's quite a ways down here in the tape,
yes,
right?
Yeah,
So
that's
you're
all
going to
towards
do
the
that
end.
now.
Yeah, I was
Okay,
going to do
please.
that. Well, it's quite long, so John requested that we summarize some of the points that he raises for discussion at the end, well, the last 20 minutes of his talk, and just to sort of pose those questions to you all and get your feedback, hopefully. Of course, you heard John just now mention, why are we doing this? What's the point of translating the entire kanjur or a kanjur? Should we be doing this, right? Can we do it? Is it doable? Is it a realistic project? Related to that is the notion that the text in the Kanjur, and the Kanjur itself as a collection, was most often used in traditional Tibetan circles in ritualistic ways, not necessarily read for content, right? So then in rendering it into English and sort of treating it as though it is a conveyor of content, are we not, in a sense, running the risk of violating a certain sort of functional correspondence, and using the term of Susan Bassnett that she mentioned 2 mornings ago? Is that a problem? Maybe not. And so I'm not going to present John's responses to that, but rather open. Well, there's a few others that I just want to sort of flag. The issue of the tantras. There are many challenges with translating all of the tantras. Number one is the secrecy aspect of the tantras, right? Making them widely available online is perceived by many in practice circles as a violation of certain modalities of reception, certain styles of reception. You know, you should receive initiation and formal instruction, so forth, before you can read the tantras. Another issue is that how difficult they are to translate, how very, very difficult some of them are, how many of them have no commentarial material whatsoever attached to them. So can they be translated? They present very unique, thorny problems for the translator. Many are not, as well, John mentions, there can be some contention on this with Bob, you might disagree, but John mentions that many are not practiced anymore. Many are sort of, there's no real lineage for their transmission. They're just sort of preserved in the conjures. Many in the Kriya class and the Charya class fall into this category. So should we even bother with them, right? I mean, that's an issue. Another related issue, and this doesn't just pertain to tantras, but also to some of the sutras, is what role should the commentarial literature play in the translation of these materials? So if you're working with a tantra with several commentaries that are present in the tenjur, are you going to sort of translate according to one only, or are you going to provide some sort of hyperlink to all the multiple interpretations? And there's also issues of certain tantras or certain passages, certain whole chapters being so arcane that you actually can't even understand them at all without the help of the commentary. And then you turn to the commentaries, and they're totally different interpretations, of course. So that presents a series of issues that I'm sure can be resolved, but definite problems to address. So that's really what John elaborated upon in the remaining part of his video.
Okay, well then I think I'll go a little further before we go to the open thing. And on the why, John's why, I even if I hadn't been asked to do this, I think I'm very happy that I have been doing it since 45 years now. 1972, I've been working on this, and I'm pleased to think that I can work on it in my next 2 lives at least, and I certainly intend to do so, if I'm hopefully in a place where I'm human and I can have access to these great texts. And the reason I think is, first of all, I think we should be encouraged about it. I was just thinking earlier when Rinpoche was talking that the ultimate translator was the Buddha, of course. As you know, one of the 18 Avenika dharmas of the Buddha, the uncommon properties of a Buddha, is that a Buddha speaks a sentence and everyone in the vast assembly hears it in their own language. Like he had Star Trek translator machinery operating. And so it seems to be possible. And then the second thing I was thinking of is the Mantabhadra prayer, or vow, however you translate Manlam, Pranidhana. He says he's going to teach the Dharma in every language, even the language of the Nagas, language of the Devas, language of the Garuda, whatever it is, he's going to teach it. Mlecha language even. I think that would be us, the Mlecha language. And from the Indian point of view. And so I think it is something that is a natural thing to do. If one thinks that the Buddha Dharma is something of great value to the world, and if one realizes that the immense use of it that happened in India, Tibet, and Mongolia especially, with parts of it going elsewhere also, East Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia, then to deprive the world of it as long as the world is still there and hasn't been ruined by the oligarchs totally, it's a natural thing to want to keep translating all of it, I think. And also, you know, in the earlier conference a few times ago, I was very happy when I think it was Bellows who talked about there are two types of translations. And one type is the one where the translator feels they're looking from a higher culture into a lower culture and are translating something because it's like a museum piece or something of interest, or something of curiosity kind of, but it's enriching the higher culture because it's broadening its knowledge of these other backward and old-fashioned and obsolete cultures. But and that's one way. And the other way is the Lodzawa way that the Tibetan ancestors did it, where they are working the loka chakshu, as they said in Sanskrit, Lodzawa, meaning I call it a public eye, not the private eye like a detective, but a public eye, who is an eye for the public to see into a higher world than the one of us. Now, this in a way is the difference between, I think, academic translations that have mostly happened until now, till the last few decades, and Dharma translations. And the academics are looking at a lower culture as far as they're concerned. And I put that, my phrase that I put it to be memorable, is I say that Buddha could not possibly have had a higher consciousness or been really enlightened in our sense of the word, because he didn't have a PhD from Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard. So since he's not a modern professor and on top of the modern, wonderful materialist science, he couldn't have been enlightened, not possible. He was like ignorantly thinking that he was whatever, you know. Because it's ancient people, we're all ignorant, you know, they're all backward, underdeveloped and so on. But I think the Lodzawa way is that actually this culture is backward and underdeveloped, incredibly violent, nuclear weapons, destroying the planet with greed and hatred. It's really, this culture is a culture built on taking 2 out of the 3 kleshas, based on having a rich amount of the main klesha, which is ignorance or misknowledge, and then taking hatred and greed and blowing hatred up into industrial militarism and nuclear weapons, and greed blowing that up into industrial consumerism and destroying the climate. Right? You could say that, and I don't think that's a high culture personally. It's nice, we have Uber to travel around, you know, we have computers, but we need a higher culture of how to control the kleshas. We need a curriculum in the world, and actually we can also take heart there from the Tibetans. Tibetans were a total bunch of savages and terrible military conquerors. They had their own pentagon, you know, and the Chinese, Han Chinese, were terrified of them. And not only that, the women were really powerful. They were scared of those fierce Tibetan women. And there are theories that the Amazon myth came from Tibetan women who, you know, being nomadic women and milking yaks and things and throwing out the guys if they misbehaved. They were pretty forceful as far as Chinese went in the way they treated women. And so they were like that. And then this curriculum came up, and the texts are, of course, only part of it. The oral traditions, the Siddha traditions, the yogis and things were also very important, and the curriculum in the live monastic thing, the debates and all that was all really important. But the curriculum basis, the library, the great, what they call Ratnodadi, the ocean of jewels, which was the 9-story library of Nalanda University, and then all the other universities had other equally huge libraries. They say that the fire lit by the Muslim guy who burned it down in 1172 burned for months of all the books burning, you know, like huge amounts of books. But the most important ones, as far as the Tibetans of that time went, were the ones in the Kanjur and Tenjur. And so that changed, that presence in the Tibetan culture, although not by no means did all the Tibetans be able to read all of it, or even those who did not necessarily realized all of it, but many, many, tens of thousands of them did. And they shifted from a militaristic conquest culture to a culture based on the ideal of the self-conqueror, the person who conquered their kleshas and who became a decent, nice, gentle person, civilized person, in other words. And you can say that's the Shambhala, Shangri-La-izing, you know, academics will say that, because the academic thing that's going on in the last 2 decades, decade and a half, about Buddhism, in reaction against the popularity of Buddhist studies in academia and among undergraduates and things, in America anyway, in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, is, the big style, and you get really advanced in your career and you get tenure and you really do well if you spend your life writing about what's wrong with Tibet, what's wrong with Buddhism, how they are just as bad as the Christian Crusaders and all of that. That's very important to modern religious studies academia, I'm sorry to say. After 45 years in it, almost 50 years in it, I can say that, I think. So therefore, they don't want this curriculum necessarily, but it's our duty to try to make it available. It may take several generations, as His Holiness said to the President of Colombia. And as the President rightly said, they don't have the system there yet, but they should have the system, if things will survive. And I want to just also sketch what my dream is, for what I'm trying to do in my dotage, in my sunset years now. First of all, I should tell everyone, some of you may be younger and may be working, that in 2 years, 3 years, I think, there'll be a search for my chair, which is an endowed chair. And the charter of that endowed chair is someone who will teach general Buddhism, of course, on a Tibetan Indian base, but whose research interests will involve texts of the Tenjur and therefore would be suitable to supervise the continuing translation of that. Which doesn't mean, of course, that the department will honor that full charter, full details of that charter, because academic departments are notorious from, rationalizing something a little different out of some charter of a chair, endowed chair. But there will be this opportunity for anybody who's another younger Tenjur fanatic, or who likes Shastras, who likes Mahayana Abhidharma and Vajrayana Abhidharma. I consider there to be such a thing, although we don't use the category. But those Shastras are definitely like that. Now then, the other thing, the thing about the Tantras is a big problem. Oh yeah, I want to also say, I was very delighted with the founding of 84,000, and Khyentse Rinpoche very kindly, and actually Ana Cristina Lopez, or you have the new name is now Gentry, was the woman who brought me that invitation from Khyentse Rinpoche at that time. She was studying in Colombia at that point, I think, or you'd finished, but you dropped by. And he wanted me to be there for that conference, and I was thrilled when Tom also came with me, who has been my indispensable colleague there, working on the Tenjur and editing them and publishing them, and translating them also. And so I loved that event at Beer, and I was thrilled to see that, because Khyentse Rinpoche was promising to raise the money so that this kind of thing could begin to happen in a systematic way. And I think main sources being mainly Chinese Buddhists, I think. And therefore, main interest among them are sutras. They're not interested in tantras. They're scared of tantras. But to me, that's a really important subject. I don't know your fields, those of you who are here, but I want to encourage anyone who's younger and choosing research fields, that of course you have to study what you love, and that's well known. But so I'm not saying change your fields in any way. But a major thing, I think, in the next 2-3 decades is going to be the interaction of Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism, what is considered traditional, which is Amitabha, Pure Land is the big thing, and Chan, those are the two big things in Chinese Buddhism. There's a little Huayan and a little Tiantai is still alive, but mainly those two kinds of things, and based on sutras, and they really never really got going with the tantras, with the esoteric stuff. It jumped over into Shingon in Japan, but not in China. So since Tibet is going to remain, hopefully, a genuinely autonomous region within China, the whole plateau, that means, not just the TAR, and since the Tibetans will be able to do their Buddhism, and since they already have hundreds of thousands of Chinese disciples and students and fans, how this will fit in with the traditional Buddhist schools as they revive, as the communists get a little less oppressive in general, and how they perceive Tibetan Buddhism and how they perceive it as a resource, not just of magic or wealth pujas or whatever it might be, but also of more dharma, more things that Xuanzang didn't bring. Xuanzang didn't bring the really great Madhyamaka, later Shastras. He didn't really bring the Pramana stuff and things that there's a bit of in Chinese Buddhist texts, but not much. And the Fadzun tradition, where from the 30s of translating Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa and other things into Chinese, died out, and hopefully it will come back up. And so the thing about the tantras is we must do them, we must deal with them. we all went after the beer conference over to Dharamsala because His Holiness graciously gave us all an audience, the whole gang, from beer, went in a big bus. And then when that question was asked to His Holiness, what about the tantras? Against the background that Sakya-Chidzin said he didn't want people doing tantras, and I think maybe Peno Rinpoche also said he didn't want to see any tantras published in the broad. I think both of them said that. Yeah, Tuesday Rinpoche was okay about it to some extent. And they asked Dalai Lama, what about it? And he said, don't publish root tantras without first publishing the commentaries, which sort of carries over to the Tenjo, which is where the commentaries are. Tenjo is also mostly tantra. You know, Tom, you have these pie chart things, and this, when you do pie charts of Kanjra and Tenjo, it's like huge, this is tantra, you know. And then sutras and other things, you know, literature and medicine, there's smaller things over here. So I think we must do tantras, and I consider tantras the most advanced of the Buddhist sciences, you could say, the Buddhist texts. Really, they're the wonderful jewels of things, as we know, as you all know, I'm sure. And so we can't ignore them, but we can't expect necessarily the Chinese only to fund them, you know, because it's not their initial interest, and it's very important to have the exoteric sutras and more of the exoteric shastras for them. So my vision, my hope, what I'm trying to set up nowadays is an institution in India, which would be where I have this vision of a round table. And this round table would have a lot of computer equipment in the middle, so everybody would have whatever they need from any language in that. And then it would depend on people from China, from Japan, from Russia, from the European countries, from the US, from Latin America. And whoever was sending a graduate student or a Dharma student who was just sending themselves, or a faculty member on a sabbatical from any university of any of those places, would come to that round table. And then the people at that round table, maybe two people, the pundit, the Sanskrit pundit, because even if there is no Sanskrit text, to go into Indo-European languages anyway, it's useful to have Sanskrit knowledge, even in dealing with those books that were originally Sanskrit. It's really important, I think, to do that. And then people around that round table, they write down the result in their own language. And I think that the Chinese be there. I was very thrilled at Bergen in Norway last summer, when there were so many young Chinese who were doing graduate work in universities in China, in Chengdu and Beijing and other places, and some of them outside who were getting into Tibetan studies, Buddhist Tibetan studies. I thought it was really exciting. More Chinese than Japanese in that case in Norway, you know. And so they would be there because the Chinese canon needs to expand. And then English, of course, would be the two primary things maybe. And then whoever else would come. And people in Japan, I was there this spring, and they in some institution there, and they claimed they would send people and they would support this, and they're into it. They love one thing is they have money, which is nice, and I think there are some different possibilities in India. Some Indians who are interested in this. Finally, it's hard to sell this idea to Indians too, because they think they're Hindus, you know, and they think it comes from the Vedas, and they don't realize the Buddhist and Jain, you know, the Shramana, as Elman and Joshi would say, the Shramana contribution to what they think now of as Hinduism. And so it's not, they don't think of it as their like old, you know, like Dead Sea Scrolls or something. It's hard to get them to think that. But a few of them maybe are beginning to do so. Basically on the basis of His Holiness's wonderful charisma and his circulation among them, and his constantly mentioning Nalanda and the 17 pundits, and I think he's been huge. Of course, he's the main driver of a lot of this, you know, of course. We know that, right? as the translator. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. That's my vision of the round Dharma Chakra Translation Institution to translate these things and all the Songbums. And there are a few Sanskrit works that pop up in Sanskrit here and there that were not translated into the Tenjur. And then His Holiness has always wanted to see, I mean, you could expand, he's always wanted to see the Mahasangika Vinaya and these things from Chinese, Mahayana Sanskrit originally things, would come into Tibetan. He wants to enrich the Tibetan one like that. He doesn't consider that static, you know. He wants that to come into Tibetan. And so there would be multilingual, going in multi-directions like that is the vision, but the root of it would be to continue on for the next couple of generations doing the Tenjur. And of course, in that light, he mentioned terminology. That's right. In the terminological context, the dream has always been to have like a multilingual, modern language, Mahavyutpati, equivalent of a Mahavyutpati, but or like Dagye Kebe Jungne. Jankarowe Dorje in the 18th century, with funding from the Manchu Emperor Qianlong, he supervised the translation with many monks assigned to the job from Tibetan into Mongolian of the entire Tenjur in a single lifetime. So that was really marvelous because he had the funding, he had imperial funding, which there's no emperor yet we've found yet to do that into English. And we can't really expect Tibetans to be quite as concerned about that except out of compassion, because in a way this is to enrich these mlecha, these barbarian cultures like the former European and colonial cultures, to get them to become more peaceful and to deal with their kleshas. So it's really to the benefit of the English speakers and the French speakers and things. It isn't really a Tibetan thing. The Tibetans like to just be able to do it back in Tibet and continue to travel around, have a visa and whatever. You know. So okay, that's what I had to say about it. So now the floor is open, I guess, right, Tom? And you are managing the questions. Do we have a mic,
Yes.
traveling mic, or maybe we don't need it?
Yeah, we have a mic. We probably should use a mic just because also for recording for the sake of the video. Let's see if this is on.
Is it functioning? Anyway, does anybody have any comment, question?
This,
We're supposed
okay.
to have some
Is this mic
discussion.
on? I'll see if I can get the. Not sure yet. Is this mic here working? Perhaps this one will work. Oh, this one looks like it's working. Can that one be turned on? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bob, you mentioned that His Holiness the Dalai Lama said that we need to do the commentaries on the
I'm going to
tantras.
walk around because I have a hearing problem.
Oh, okay.
Even you have a mic. Yes. Sorry.
You said that His Holiness said that the commentaries on the tantras should be translated before the tantras
Yes,
themselves.
he did not want root tantras presented to the public until their commentaries had become more well known. You know, because of the shocking statements of the Vajra words, you know, which will has already led to tremendous misinterpretation.
Okay,
He did
wha-
say that to Tukutapek Pema Wangel, Gene Smith, you know, all of the assembled dignitaries.
Okay, I just want to add a little piece to that, and this may be for Tom or for both of you. You were mentioning the Guhya Samaja project where there are, the supplementary tantras in the Kangyur, but they're like commentary type or explanatory tantras, I guess they're called. So how would that fit into this thing?
Okay, the Guhya Samaja, well, let me first say, in light of that thing, David Gray, who's sort of a little bit on our team, although he does other things too, he works for 84,000 as well, he did the Chakrasambhara Tantra for his thesis, and he used Tsongkhapa's commentary and wrote that up, you know, the Beden Kunsel, and he consulted also the Sakyapa, Sonon Zemo's commentary, I think that's one, or Sachen Kunga Nimbo's commentary, I think. Sachen, that's right, Sachen, not Sonon Zemo, Sachen. And he looked at other commentaries as well. And he just didn't get that delivered, and also we delayed in getting it published because we were very undermanned, underfunded, and understaffed, so that the root tantra came out earlier, so it was against the Lama's precept. And where I was editing some final editing in Thailand, in one of those a Shangri-La hotel on the 30th, 40th floor, and I was doing some of the last editing, and in the chapters on the Dakinis, and the don't do this and don't show that. And then there was this thunderstorm outside and lightning bolts shooting around. Okay, we're going to get that commentary out real soon. And so I'm so relieved we finally have that. You know, we have the first 23 printed, and the other one he's finished, and we're going to print that this year. I hope, although I would defer to Tom about exactly the timing. But so that's that. The Guhya Samaja started in, again, a dissertation of a student. And then we got an NEH grant to work on it with a team. And then that ended too fast. Then we had a Tsadra grant also to add Tsongkhapa's commentary. And we have most of that raw material. And that will all come together. There will not be any publication of Guhya Samaja just by itself. I mean, a version of it was already published, of course, by, what's her name in England, lovely, what's her name? of the lady.
Francesca
Student of
Freeman.
Trungpa Rinpoche, who published it already in England working under Snellgrove. Just the root tantra. And the root tantra is there quoted in Chandrakirti's Pradipodhyotana, which is the Jansel, which is the master commentary from India, although there are many others. And then Jada Rinpoche's Chendel fits in with Chandrakirti's commentary. And they will all come together, although maybe there will be, first volume will be just the Pradipodhyotana and the 1 through 12, Pradipodhyotana and Guhya Samaja 1 through 12. Second volume will be the same 1 through 12 with Tsongkhapa's annotation. Third volume with 13 through 17, just the Pradipodhyotana, and then the fourth volume will be with the Jada Rinpoche's commentary. His commentary is less lengthy in the later chapters. And so that is going in the proper Lama ordained way, that Guhya Samaja.
And
Okay.
I might just add
What's that?
I might just add one comment on a sort of a fun technical way in which we've been addressing this project. We're not able to do this all the time, but we have a very brilliant graduate student who's very good at typing up text and creating critical editions. So he's made critical editions of various Sanskrit editions and Tibetan editions. We've compiled them into a single Google Doc where they can all be seen side by side. And we put that up as a Google Doc, and we can sit around the table as a translation team and even have people Skyping in. So you have, anywhere from 4 to 8 people working simultaneously, looking at the multiple editions simultaneously, conversing simultaneously, typing up translations, on the fly as we go. So it's sort of a nice technological solution we're now able to implement.
When you do that kind of technology, though, finally you do get back to the human beings.
Sure.
And then it's terribly slow if you do that. Somehow you have to, one person has to produce a draft.
That's really just an intermediate stage.
Do that with it.
Right.
And the editing process.
It sort of captures everything in one, and then you still have to then take it from there to produce the final published version, which is quite a separate, longer enterprise. But at least we're getting a good rough draft, comparing all the editions and having multiple voices chiming in simultaneously. It's a nice intermediate stage.
There is another thing that's interesting. Geshe Samden has been talking for some time with Nitish Kumar, who's the governor of Bihar. And he, at one time, before he lost his political place, then they went into hibernation for the plan, for a couple of years. But now he's back in power. And they are seriously talking about making a big thing in Patna, although Geshe-la is trying to move it out of Patna, to translate the whole Kanjur Tenjur into Hindi. And they've pottered away at CUTS on that little bit of this and that back into Sanskrit. But the idea of translating it into Hindi, I think, would be really valuable. And maybe in Telugu, maybe, because we're thinking of making this institution in South India. So then that would involve a Telugu graduate student from Hyderabad University. And so I think it's great. Yes?
Well, thank you very much.
Yes,
I think, when the idea of translating the entire Kanjuru came up, of course, I was deeply impressed because it's also very audacious in terms of scope, vision, and the, implications of resource that needs to be raised. But at the same time, being very practical, immediately the question was, is it really helpful? Is that the way to go? Can't we have a system of prioritization so that what the tradition feels is most beneficial, that may have most appeal, that could be really of benefit to a larger community? Couldn't there be a way in which, even though our overall vision may be to get the whole thing out, but they could be done in a way that is a much more systematic? But then things don't unfold in this way. But on the other hand, I do appreciate that Tengyur and Kangyur represents a kind of a closed canon. So there is a kind of a finite, bounded nature to these collections. So it's a bit like Encyclopedia Britannica type. So to have, from a Tibetan point of view, having them in English seems to be a brilliant idea. It's a tremendous source of pride because in both Kanjur and Tengyur kind of represents a powerful achievement of the Tibetan people, collectively. And although, one of the things, if you look at the history of Kanjur and Tengyur, is these texts were translated across many centuries, not in an organized way. There were definitely in the early stages, there was a top-down approach. There was imperial funding. There were groups of students sent to Kashmir and all the rest and everything. But the texts themselves were, scattered around. And the genius of Chomden Regrel and his students was to really put them together, to have some kind of collection, which then Putin revised, although we all attribute him to be the compiler, but he's actually the reviser. It was Regrel and his students who, in fact, did the compilation. So that has ensured the survival of all of this material. And in a way, this is similar to what Jamgon Kongtrul did with Damga Zö. If Jamgon Kongtrul hasn't created the Damga Zö, probably many of the minor lineages, instructions which are there, where people no longer were having monasteries that are part of those community, lineages, would have died out. So in that sense, the collections really played an important role for the survival and continuation of these instructions. But I'm wondering whether an English translation of an entire set like this, an English translation of an entire set like Kanguru or Tenguru,
Yeah.
I can't see them having that kind of function because the texts themselves survive in Tibetan original.
Well,
Yeah, so that benefit isn't there. So then the question is it a question of prestige? You can have projects that has more to do with the prestige of the vision than actual practical benefits. And the question did come up right at the beginning in the James, you were listing some of the questions, one of which was the functions of the Kanguru. The Tibetans very rarely use them, for their contents, except for in great writers who wants to ground their explanation in some Kanguru citations. But most, a very large percentage of the Kanguru is not really used in that from the content point of view. Mm-hmm. Of course, they are revered and all the rest. So it does raise, a lot of questions because, there's a kind of a certain ethical responsibility that goes with having major, projects like this because you have resource implications. And there's an element of zero-sum game. When the resources are poured in one, it does preclude other things. And I'll give you a simple example. To this day, we don't even have the translation of Pramanavartika,
right.
a text that is so central to the whole Indian Buddhist tradition, which is a major object of engagement by non-Buddhists for centuries. For the Tibetan tradition, there are tons and tons of commentaries on this.
So what's keeping you?
So, what I'm trying to say is that for those of you who are involved in this large-scale project, is there something that you could do so that some of these could be prioritized, so that even though your vision is to bring the whole thing out,
Yeah.
the ones that could have a real impact. Imagine if the Pramanavartika is in English, in readable English that is accessible. It would speak volumes to the cognitive scientists who are looking into the Buddhist resources about what they have to say about philosophy of language and acquisition of, general terms. How do children learn? By looking at, a black dog and then seeing a white dog and say, this is also a dog. Why is it that the children doesn't pick up on the color but on, is able to transfer that knowledge? And, there's a huge amount of those kind of discussion. So my basic point is this. Is there a way in which the people who are in charge like yourself...
Did that. We did a prioritization by doing the 17 Pandit version, which is like 30 million in 20 years. Then there's the whole thing, which is like, 60 or something. I forgot. You made a thing based on like the 84,000 does, based on a per-page payment to various translators around the world, which we don't have that money, so we haven't been able to initiate it. But then there's when we have approached a few very wealthy people who do not see it as a priority, that's the problem. Then there's the 17 Pandit version. Then there's the whole version, and there. So you do, and anybody would translate the Pramanavartika. That's why I asked what was keeping you. We would edit it and try to publish it, or if Sonolion or Wisdom.
Well, I mean, I'm not a
we'd be delighted.
Sanskritist. It needs to be done by a Sanskrit.
What's that?
I'm not a Sanskritist. It needs to be done from the Sanskrit, from Vartika.
For those
Well, somebody should do Pramanavartika. Like John Donne was originally supposed to do it. Then he was off doing the Prasanapada. Then I don't know what happened to him. He was supposed to pick up Nagatomi, who had translated the Tsemikevu chapter. He was supposed to pick that up down at Harvard and do the whole Pramanavartika. And he did the Prajaksha chapter, so that's two. But they didn't. He didn't finish it. What can I do? What? Sorry.
Prajaksha chapter is only in Japanese, not in English, though.
Yeah. The Japanese. Also, it's in Chinese. They have a Chinese version of Pramanavartika too. I'm not sure how good it is, but they have one. And so that's good. Yeah, listen, we're defective. Make a donation. We'll work. We'll sign it to someone.
Could I respond to a little bit to what you said, Chipala?
What?
I just want to respond a bit to
please.
that, because one of the intentions behind translating the entire Kangyo, at least, was to provide a firm foundation for scriptural authority in its target culture. So the consideration was beyond what might be immediately relevant to other audiences, but the concern was more long-term, as I understand it. Just let me finish. Hold on.
Sure, please. I thought you had.
So, the commentaries are, of course, commenting on that, on those scriptural sources. So the idea was, without any kind of firm foundation of scriptural authority, without those texts actually available in the English, there would, those subsequent commentaries, however relevant they might be for different scientific communities, or, how interesting they might be for contemporary philosophical discourse, it would not be appreciated within its context as commentary on Buddha Vachana. And so the concern was with the longevity of the Dharma, I think, on this planet, more than anything else. And less so with the relevance of this or that collection. But even having said that, there is a list of priority texts, on the website, things that are sort of suggested, that are more relevant for a contemporary audience. And admittedly, many of those tantras that deal with mundane goals in the Kriya section and so forth, outside of a few wandering sorcerers out there, might be somewhat irrelevant.
And I can weigh in just quickly and clarify, fill in some details very briefly on the 17 Pundits priority, what that's about. The Tangur is about twice the size of the Kangur. The Tangur is roughly 4,000 texts by about 700 Indian authors. And we're taking direction from His Holiness, who looked at, is quite aware as a great scholar of these 4,000 texts, 700 authors. And as many of you know, he sort of has selected 17 Pundits in particular that he found to be the most important authors. And they're names that probably all of us would know: Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Gunaprabha, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and so forth. Their texts, there's about, if I remember my numbers right, those 17 Pundits have about, I think, 700 texts out of the 4,000. So and if you count up folios, which is sometimes a more accurate way of looking at the volume you're dealing with, it's about 1/6 of the folios of the Tangur. So it's about 1/6 of what the Tangur. So that would be certainly our priority. To date, what we do certainly sometimes, if a translator has something ready to go and submits it to us, we'll take it under consideration and oftentimes put it into the pipeline to get it published. But what we would like to do is have the funding to be able to actually subvent and start to prioritize the translation of those particular texts. So yes, the priority is very important, but sometimes you publish what comes to your doorstep.
Yes, we would take your advice. As you know, you're on the editorial board of our institution, and thankfully, and we're grateful for that. And we would certainly take that advice if we were in a position like 84,000, where we had an income flow, where we could then put out a notice. And we had hoped to do. We eventually hoped to do this before we dropped dead. And that is, if anybody would be working on this or this text, please send it in. And like the Tarkajwala, I've been trying to assemble. At one time, Takasaki took my translation of Tarkajwala, of one of his chapters, and I tried to collect them, and then he passed away and didn't finish that. And I was in Japan trying to find out what happened to that, and nobody knows. And so maybe we'll just try to redo that, get the same group of people who did all those different chapters, for example. So that's the kind of thing we would like to do. And if we ever are in a funding position to be able to do that and put up a thing saying, anybody working on Pramanavartika, that's a top thing, we'll do that. And so that your suggestion is absolutely correct. And your whole thing of the classics is precisely a prioritizing thing. You're taking things that are very important, and you have like what, 17 volumes or something, or 20 volumes? And a lot of that, what? 32. But, and you've done like 17? Or?
Basically what we did was we have...
That's why I said you should be up here, because yours is a big project too, and it's prioritized.
No, I mean, mine is a manageable project, let me put it that way. It's 32 large volumes, you know, taking inspiration from the 32 major marks of the Buddha, so as an auspicious number. But there were two parts of the project. One was the creation of the Tibetan volumes, so that the Tibetan texts are annotated, paragraph breaks, subheadings, list of contents, you know, citations sourced, and all of that. So that was one part. So that's done. The whole 32 volumes are done with all the critical editions and everything. And then the second part is the translation. In the translation, we have 9 volumes out, 2 at the press, and then except for 2 still needs to be commissioned. But you know, basically we have the translators. We're just a matter of assigning the dates and getting the contract. One of them is going to be Gavin. The other one is going to be Matthew Kapstein. And then one volume which I've reserved for myself. I don't know whether I'll have the time. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. But other than that, the rest are all in process. They're taking very long. But
They're in process. Yeah.
They're in process. All the funding is underwritten.
Right.
So it is, you know, and our hope is that from 2018, every year we're aiming to have 2 out, so that within 12 years, it will be all done.
Right.
Because otherwise, you know, people are beginning to say, my funders are particularly beginning to say that, Jimpa, I don't think I'm going to see this, the end of this before I die. So, but it's a sort of number is, I mean, the volumes are big, but number is manageable.
Right.
And these are all Tibetan texts, no Indian texts. Yeah.
So anyway, whatever much we can get done in whatever short a time, the one thing that at least we have, if I were to croak tomorrow, someone is supposed to be, if they're honest, at the Columbia University Religion Department, they have $6 million endowment that is supposed to hire someone to continue supervising, translating the Denjo. Of course, they also have to teach, and they have to work like double time doing that as well as teach a regular thing. But they have to do it. And the problem, of course, is you can't spend that capital, and you get $40,000 a million. So that's only $240,000 a year. And they have to take a senior professor plus all the overhead, and they have a ridiculous bunch of taxes that they take. So the university tries to take much of the money as they can. But at least, unless they cheat, that is supposed to continue. Even if the market crashes, then the university is responsible still to keep hiring that person, unless they shut down the university. So that at least is that's the 3 generations that this holiness is talking about. But someone older than me. But someone will do that unless they cheat and put in some anthropologist, which is the fashion now, the latest mode in academia, is because precisely they don't respect the traditions, is to hire anthropology sort of types who will go and see what they're doing on the ground, you know, in Mustang, you know, like what are they doing there? Which ritual, which thing are they making? And we don't care what they read, you know, it's all irrelevant type of thing, you see. That's the fashion in the religious studies, not philology and not the ancient text, unfortunately, you know. But really, you know, for example, if this was something that was discovered in Ethiopia, you know, like some more Library of Alexandria or something, 30 million, 100 million would be not a big deal for the humanistic institutions in the West, you know, the big foundations and things. They would immediately want to spend that. Or if it was an extra Veda that nobody knew about in India, they would spend that immediately. It's not really a big amount of money we're talking about. We're used to being a marginalized community, of sort of a new thing. They don't really know what it is. And even they don't like to think that it's something really fascinating, you know, and important, except unless they're already a Dharma person, you know. So that's the problem, you know. That's the problem we face, funding problem and knowledge problem. The other thing I want to say, though, about the translation aspect, if I may, that, translating a massive bunch of text like this into a new language that doesn't have them, since all texts are conventions and conventionalities, then a new way of thinking that is a better way of thinking, actually, than Western philosophy has managed, actually, although there's some traces of it everywhere. Like people like Wittgenstein or Spinoza, they've come up with some great, even Socrates and his people, pre-Socratics. But it will change the culture itself. And it will hopefully relieve the materialist scientists from their planet-destroying, stupid ideas that they've discovered. They think they've discovered everything is matter. They think so. They do. They do not agree that there's a mind other than matter when they go talk to you and His Holiness. They do not really agree. They're polite because they love hanging out with His Holiness, as everybody does. But they absolutely don't agree. They totally don't. And how to meet that issue, and how do they, His Holiness's vision of the inner science of India, not just Buddhism, but India, Adhyatma Vidya, meeting the outer science of these materialists, which is so powerful but out of control. How to accomplish that? That's actually the bigger, more immediate mission before they blow us all up.
One of the aspects that is an interesting thing that just came to mind is that these translations also are not under our control and can have unexpected consequences.
The translations?
Yeah, and I mean positive consequences. In other words, something that seems quite irrelevant, in its canon.
Yes,
rendered
John
well.
mentioned some surprises that he's found.
Yeah, so there can be
about
some
death and grieving and things like that. Yes, definitely.
Some wonderfully pertinent textual passages or whole texts that then can take on a life of their own and even possibly be formative of new Western Buddhist traditions. Who knows, right? So, I mean, it's something that we just can't predict, the consequences.
Yeah. And Abhidharma, not only that, but Abhidharma Kosha needs a new facelift, 2.0, 3.0. There's a bunch of versions around from the Chinese and this and that. But Dilla Valley Pusan's thing, but there needs to be a new Abhidharma. And Vinaya too. We have to have some like Americans controlling it, So everything needs to be done. Yes.
I just wanted to state the obvious that it seems both 84,000 and the Columbia Project have the plan to translate the Tengyur. Are you in communication with each other about those plans, or how does the discussion between the two institutions go?
I couldn't catch that, please.
Thank you for addressing the elephant in the room.
What's that?
That 84,000 has the plan to translate the Tengyur.
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
But
what would ever stop anybody from doing it? Anything you do, then we don't have to do. That's great.
But I expect rich collaboration in the future.
Well, that's how he invited us to his original conference.
Yeah.
But so far he's been working with his Chinese people, and they've been doing the sutras, and that's great. I'm also very interested. I think it's very important to translate a lot of things into Chinese. I really do. The Fazun, they were at Tsadra, these Chinese monks in the 30s and 40s, and they did but the Chinese do not know about that. That was not included in their canon. And they think of it, so they're not sure what it is, And Richard Chi, there was a man named Richard Chi that nobody's here ever heard of, probably was at, I think in Indiana. He was Chinese, and he was into logic, and he was into Pramanavartika and so on, and that kind of thing. And he told a story that I never really pursued, but somebody with all the Chandrakirti and Dharmakirti and Dignaga etc. arrived in Tang Dynasty, China, and was given a building and a bunch of monks to work for him, and etc. I don't know the name. And the Xuanzang people, a generation or two afterwards, went over and burned it down. And so they never were translated at that time, And then that's why the Chinese Dawa, is very Semzamba, It's extremely, in general, very much Semzamba. They like Semzamba. And they need, now so that's a big, to me, important thing, I feel. I think His Holiness is into that. That's an exoteric thing, too, not Tantra. Very important for them. I always used to tell, when I would give talks in Tokyo or in Hong Kong or somewhere, I would say, you guys just all worship Xuanzang, He went across the desert with a monkey, and he got the sutras, whatever he could bring. You guys just have to go in an airplane. The Dharamsala or Sarah got to Drepung, and you can translate a whole bunch more stuff he didn't bring. And what's the matter? And they're like, we have our canon, you know, Chinese canon, you know, Taizhou canon, you know, and they get all closed in on it, you know. Similarly, His Holiness, the Tibetan canon will increase, you know, as the more we work on all of this. I think we find treasures here and there. There must. Yes, please.
I've got a similar problem that Thupten Jinpa has just raised. I've been asked to translate one of the volumes of the Dangangzi. It's the Natsok Tree, which is, or one of the Natsok Tree volumes, which will probably not be very widely taught, not as much as many of the Kaiju and Nyingma
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
teachings
what
in the
text that
same,
is.
in the Dangangzi, the Natsok Tree.
Oh, Dhammayagzu. Oh,
Yeah, and I find, of course, there's some wonderful texts in it. There are some 30 texts within this particular volume. Some of great interest, instructions are very inspiring and all. But there are a series of empowerments, or jenangs in fact, which some of them correspond to, well, one of them corresponds to a sadhana, which is also within the collection. There are jenangs which don't seem to correspond to any sadhana at all. And I do wonder what is the real value, certainly for the time being, of translating these jenangs. First of all, whether they will ever, whether there will be practices for which they'll apply. And secondly, at the moment, I wouldn't have thought all that many people in the West who are, well, either authorized or who have the necessary training to give an empowerment, because it's not simply a question of reading the text. And so translating these jenangs, I do have this slight conflict of, you know, whether they'll really be useful. I did put this question to a Lama the other day, and he said, well, you never know. But,
right.
you know, there's this similar problem.
Right. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? We have a good 20 minutes, I think, still.
I have a question about the kind of general process of translating the text.
I can't hear at all. Yes?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, the process for translating the text in the Tengyur that you guys are going through. I know for 84,000 they have this, you know, open application, and then, you know, the translators create a group, they get the funding, it gets through reviews, and then through the editing, and then publishing, and all the rest. And I was wondering if you guys have anything set up like that, if you're, you know, if you have some open applications for translator groups to publish Tengyur texts, and how you guys are actually approaching the whole thing and setting it up in that way.
We have been developing a very similar plan to what 84,000 has been able to implement and get off the ground sooner than we have. But we've been certainly planning that kind of a template for 10 years. We sort of have it in place. But until we have really the funding to submit that, it doesn't make sense to actually, you know, put it out there and announce it and be flooded. So, but we certainly have a very similar process and template in mind and sort of ready to go. But up to date, basically, we've been working sort of one-on-one with individual translators who either we reach out to, or sometimes who've reached out to us, who are doing Tengyur text, or if you've seen the series, you know, occasionally we'll do texts from important Sungbom Tibetan texts that draw heavily on the Tengyur, are now sort of important from that third level to help elucidate the Tengyur. So we've done a few Sungbom texts as well. But certainly anybody who has a text, certainly one of the 17 Pundit texts we'd be particularly interested in. So if you have something, please reach out to us.
And then you guys would provide the funding, or?
Well, we'd have to have, not necessarily. We don't have funding to submit translations at this point, but we're actively raising the funds to try to be able to do that on a model somewhat similar to 84,000. One difference, I think, would be we're really interested in, and this is a bigger conversation, and to some extent we'll just be discussing this on the editing plenary, where as of now our plan is still to produce actual physical volumes. The printing process doesn't actually cost that much, but there's issues about longevity and text really have, and also issues of being able to cite a text it's great to be able to have an electronic text that you can constantly update, but then scholars and others have a hard time citing a text unless there's some way to sort of freeze it in time every so often. But we certainly are also beginning the process of turning all of our hard copy books into ebooks, and in the future we hope to be able to produce both simultaneously. So there will be an electronic copy of the books, but not something that's sort of online updated constantly. So it's a slightly different model in terms of publication, but otherwise very similar.
Yeah, but we would like to do that, but it is a funding issue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Tutela. Oh.
So I think you can probably answer this. In our classic series, one of the things that I was very, insistent on is to have, because I was inspired by the Yale. What was that library that that published a series of Jung's collected works, which had the page number of the original German on the margin, and that gave me an idea. So that in our classic series, in the English volume, there is a direct page reference number to the Tibetan. If we put it on the side, then it requires complicated formatting and also loss of space. So we put in the text within square brackets, so that scholars who kind of read both can have a very easy way of comparing. Now, which presupposes that you have an edition, because it has to go with the page number. So my question to you is this: in your, I have to admit I haven't looked at any of the translations that have been done so far. Maybe you have already done this. In your translation, even though it's not printed, do you insert any page reference number to the dirge or?
Yes.
Okay.
It's inserted just precisely the way you described into the body of the text, linking to the dege.
Okay, great. The other question is
not to the Peidorma, but the actual.
No. So the other question is, will the volumes? Because there are so many individual texts, and the problem with the digital publishing is that, they're spread out. So will there be some kind of integrity of the original volume boundedness of that particular volume be represented, so that in Kangyur we have Dodeka or, Uma Cha or something like that. Will that be represented as well?
Well, there is a kind of organizational rubric in place already, but that's something that's subject to revision, and there are plans in place to produce printed books eventually as well, so actual physical volumes. But the rubric in place now is just precisely according to the organizational structure of the dege.
But what about the Tohoku catalog number? Will that be at least attached to the particular entry?
Yes.
Okay,
that
great.
is.
Thank you.
That is. At the in the introductory matter of each translation.
What would be good, that makes you think, what I was talking to some people, if we developed some kind of a thing, maybe in relation to the Pedurma, if people think that's a good idea, or one of the versions of Tendur, so that everything, if Shambhala does one that's in the Tendur or Kanjur, or Wisdom does one, or one of these California presses, then they use that same notation. And so there's like a larger kind of registry of all the different things that are in Tendur and Kanjur, and then something is done. And if it's well done, things. I think there is some convergence in terminologies and things. Now there's some differences, but some convergences, and eventually it'll look like more is getting done. That way. No need to redo things twice. Not a good idea. I think waste of resources. So I think that would be a neat thing to do if all the engaged groups would sign up for a plan like that. And then we have a kind of a website, or a computer thing, Tendur website. We have this database and website. And we should put everybody else's in there, and then have like how much is done. Like we should create that. We should really work on that.
Yeah,
that's a really good idea, I think.
Yeah, currently the way to cite the 84,000 translations is really precisely by the dege page and folio numbers, because it's subject to such constant revision. But in the future, and Tom and I were talking about this a bit, it would make sense to then, compile all those changes and make annual collective changes, so that you could dispense with that older system and just cite the year edition. And,
That's good. When John mentioned that you might print a set of them at some point.
There's discussion, but it's really in the early
And I
stages
was hoping that when you do, you'll make a special bookcase that'll be high off the ground so people can come and crawl under it like they do in Tibet. And Shalu, I saw, they go and the lay people come in and they crawl under the Kangyur and Tengyur. They do, because after all, it is the Buddha's speech, right? It's just as valuable as the statue or Buddha's body, speech, and mind. The books, the texts are the Buddha's speech, right? They are a holy object. Wonderful. They really are.
There's another numbering system that we use as well. All of our publications always cite, usually on the title page, and in the introductory matter, always the Tohoku Derge number. But as you know, there's a certain number, a rather large number of texts that, for one reason or another, didn't make it into one recension or the other of the Kangyur or Tengyur. So Paul Hack has devised a numbering system for what he calls CK and CT, so comparative Kangyur and comparative Tengyur. So it's a number that can be assigned to all the texts. So there's one number that, and it's different than the Tohoku number, but it enables us to capture all the texts that are in the multiple Kangyurs and Tengyurs. So sort of a universal number. So we're beginning to put that on the title page of every book as well. And if we could certainly collaborate and and have a similar numbering system for the 84,000 texts, a universal number.
It makes good sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? We still have 10 minutes, I think. Yes.
I have one small question for James and the 84,000. You mentioned now several times that there are continual updates on translations that are already online. I was just wondering because my group was among those who published translations in the very beginning, so probably not up to the standards that are used now. How do you go about updating, editing? Is that something that the organization does, or do you contact the translators to change and update? And who decides about what can be changed? Generally, how do you organize this?
Well, you can submit those updates yourself if you find revisions that you want to make in your own translation. That's certainly something that you can submit to 84,000. You can just send something into the editorial committee and say, I would like to make these changes. I've noticed these issues that need to be addressed. Others have, just sort of browsing, sent in comments. Oh, well, this seems wrong, and sometimes it's a typo, sometimes it's an actual error, translation error, in which case 84,000 reserves the rights to just to make that change directly without necessarily consulting the translators. If it's a significant revision, though, of course, the translators will be consulted, and so that's the policy, but it's really on a case-by-case basis because these revisions are sometimes, a lot of people will be browsing and they'll make comments and, of course, having your translation widely available on the internet subjects it to all kinds of comments, some of which should be taken seriously, some of which shouldn't be really, and everything in between. So
you have to edit the comments and sort them and so on?
That's something that, Tom Tillemans and John Canti do.
I see.
I think Andreas also does a bit of that. I haven't been involved in that, but I probably will have to be at some point. But if you yourself see, things that you want to make changes to, you can just send something into the committee, and that's taken quite seriously. Those changes are made. I don't know how frequently they're made, or what the policy is on that. I think it's varying, and there have been a lot of changes also in the tech side of things, very recent changes, which if you're going to come to the meeting tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, which I should just mention. So there was organized an 84,000 translator meeting tomorrow at the Millennium Harvest Hotel. It was originally scheduled for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now it's been shifted back to 10 a.m. So for those of you who want to take part in that, we can get more into the details, such as these that you address, and anything else that's on your minds.
I did a paper in Taiwan, at Taipei, at a Buddhist Studies conference a few years ago, advocating, but I didn't execute it. I left it there. But a wiki type of thing, where you could have translations up in a kind of Wikipedia sort of thing, where people could actually retranslate something because they'd have the original text, and they could give a version, and then someone editorially would have to look at that and see what good ideas came, because things do keep changing, and people might make worthwhile. And I don't think anything is really finally set in stone. I think it's we're making new conventions, changing conventions, and I think we have to face the fact that we're still getting out from under translation technology about Buddhist texts, which is a looking down thing from the sort of modern higher culture. So if there are any among us who think that we're looking up into it, that will change things very, very much. And I just was thinking of an example to give an illustration. We have another minute or two, which is Evam maya shrutam ekasmin samaye. Thus have I heard, period, at one time, and I even had a student once, thus have I heard, once upon a time. And that thus have I heard at one time, which comes from the Pali, which is 19th century England. They're talking about a fairy tale. And they don't even, there was a big thing. I remember when I was a younger professor going at conferences, there was a big challenge like, well, we had demythologization, and we have people doing scholarship about there never was such a person as Jesus. Like, how come you guys don't do that type of thing, to the Buddhists? Challenges like that. And then, luckily, I found in the Naga, Milinda Panho, Nagasena, he says to the King Menander, the Greek guy, who says, how do you know there ever was a Buddha? And he says, well, I don't know that. I couldn't, maybe there is no Buddha, he says. But then he gives this thing about the architect, city planner of a beautifully laid out city, and well, you'd imagine somebody made a plan, And then he does the city of the Dharma talk. So that's what I used to answer that sort of thing. So we definitely are, and then, there is maybe there ever was a Buddha, Then the other thing they do is they're dating the Buddha using Pali sources. And they're desperately trying to bring the Buddha down, if hopefully level to Jesus, get down from the 6th century to the 4th, or near Ashoka, They just can't stand it that Buddha was 600 years ahead of Jesus. It freaks them out. It does. It's a problem for them. Because it's, Mediterranean, Europe, America, this has to be the supreme flow of civilization on the planet. It has to be in their mind. All the institutions are based on that. And the Brits, they did it because they conquered everybody, so therefore they were superior. So we have to realize we're getting out from, Evam maya shrutam, the ekasmin samaye should go with Evam maya shrutam. And it means I heard that. I did hear it. I like that, thus did I hear. I heard it at a specific time. And then that's the warrant that it's really it's Ananda, or it's Maitreya, or it's Manjushri, whatever different type of thing it is, usually Ananda, that he actually heard the Buddha say this on a specific occasion. That's really what it is. So, we may not agree, but that's what the text means. And so respecting the text would mean just translating it like that. Not once upon a time there's like some fairy tale of some primitive people who think there was this weird guy who had a funny tuft of hair on his forehead and emitted lights, and people had strange experiences and whatever, And then the Pali people act like we have the humanistic thing, and we're just all natural in our sandals and out there in the dust, and it's just a human Buddha. But that's nonsense. Pali, the Buddha is teaching this God and that. He goes to heaven to teach his mother, and it's just it's a totally different sci-fi world, the Buddhist world. And we may not agree with it, but we should respect it, that's what they thought. And actually, some of us do agree with it. It's like, especially when you get older, then you decide to hell with this stuff. Talking to these rednecks, seriously, they really, he didn't, Buddha, where's his PhD? Why should we listen to that? Where is it? He didn't even have aspirin. Antibiotics. Yeah, it's seriously like that. Any other question?
Time for probably one more question or comment. Okay, we've had a very full discussion. Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Bob and James.
Thank you,
Very
everyone.
much, everybody.
A lot of fun.